Evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us on a Monday evening. I'm delighted to have two guests from Citation with us tonight. Our new partners for this year. One of the reasons I took them on is because at a previous school I'd used them and they were generally superb. So Michael Brown's going to be talking us through the presentation. And obviously like to welcome Ian McLeish as well, who will be happy to answer questions. And Ian's also going to send his contact details out because we do have offers for Passage members to join Citation. So without further ado, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. I'll relay them to Michael. But as I said, thanks for joining us, Michael, and over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, can everyone see my screen that I'm sharing? So hopefully that's going to be a yes. You should be able to see the slide deck.
Yeah.
Chris, can you see it? Brilliant.
Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. Well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you very much indeed for joining me and for inviting me. My name is Michael Brown. I'm the Health and Safety Content Manager for Citation, which means I do things like this. But before this, I used to do the health and safety inspections. I was one of the traveling consultants. And before that, I worked for a research and development organization for nearly a decade. And we even had a training school there. So there were all sorts of different bits and pieces and risks that I had to deal with there, which was great fun. But I don't know, I'll just quickly introduce you to Citation. So we've been around now since 1995, so 30 years this year, and we specialize in helping businesses be better, in effect. So we deal with employment law, health, safety, and also ISO and compliance and various different things like that. So we're pretty much a one-stop shop. And again, I'm not a salesman, so I will hand that over to one of our other business partners to deal with, or if you want any details, you can contact Ian. But what I'm here to talk to you today about is a couple of myths on health and safety, and then compliance, and basically what you need to do. And in effect, I'll give you a bit of an inspection 101. So what you need to have in place to make sure that you're more likely to get through an inspection and more likely to be compliant. So I'll just cover quickly why I'm in health and safety. So in effect, it's a lot more these days about the health side than the safety side. We're quite, we've made great strides as a country in reducing deaths at work. Last year, there were sadly 124. But on the flip side of that, and this is where the government are looking now, 1.7 million people suffering work-related illness. So that's 964,000 workers suffering from work-related stress, depression, anxiety, and 543,000 suffering from work-related musculoskeletal disorders. Easy for you to say, not so easy for me to say for some reason. But again, that says to us that slips, trips, falls, things like that, poor manual handling practice are largely to blame for the musculoskeletal disorders. However, the work-related stress and ill health and things like that are definitely areas that the government are looking and focusing on. So a couple of little myths here, which I remember the safety goggles for conkers one was around when I was growing up, which was a while ago now. Yeah, absolutely myths. So again, with all of these things, it's just a matter of making sure we take proportionate steps. So obviously, there are a number of different factors which go into safety within schools. What I'm not going to cover too much today particularly is the safeguarding element of it, because I'm informed that you have a number of different lectures on that already, and honestly, it's not my field of expertise. But we will cover things like the compliance area just to make sure that you are tickety-boom what you need to have in place. So in effect, health and safety compliance means that all of your laws, regulations, and standards that apply to the workplace are in place, and that you're doing your duty so far as is reasonably practicable to prevent harm in the workplace to people that work there and others who may be in your care or presence. So again, it's just making sure that you've got those basics in place. So we can break it down into a number of different things. There's your legal requirements. It's governed by things like the Health and Safety at Work Act. There's also regulations that go under that, which govern hazard and risk management. So that's your management regulations. They're the principal ones that deal with risk assessment. You've also got supporting things. So your training policies, your procedures, education, and continuous professional development. The other part of that is the monitoring and continuous improvement. There's no good having any of the other foundations in place if you're not checking what you're doing. And again, the power of a good internal inspection, so trying to fact find for yourself, will really come full circle for you, because it will actually demonstrate that you're doing things to check that what you're doing works. So you can take a note of all of these if you like, but these are some of the main things that you need to think about. So how you're managing your health and safety at work. So that again comes down to your monitoring, your checking, your continuous improvement, and your risk management, your risk assessment. The conditions of your workplace. So making sure that actually the facilities are good, it's clean, it's tidy, it's the right temperature, and those sorts of items. Work equipment is another one. There's a set of regulations for that called the Provision of Use of Work Equipment Regulations, and that states that your equipment will be maintained. So it's just making sure that you can demonstrate that, and you've got things that are in a system or keeping an eye on it, and that things are reported when they're broken and they're isolated from use. So again, it's keeping things safe. Manual handling, I mentioned earlier, that's definitely going to be somewhere that I feel the HSE is focusing on again next year. And again, the reason for that being that it's just such a high prevalence of musculoskeletal injuries, and a lot of these are avoidable as well. Display screen equipment, hazardous substances. You might not think that applies so much, but if you've got a swimming pool, if you've got even sort of line marking paints, things like that, varnishes for floors, they will apply. Those regulations will apply. Instant reporting, you need to report certain injuries to the government, and I'll cover that in a little bit later on, and personal protective equipment as well. So just making sure that you're providing that to your workers free of charge, and that it's of good quality and that's fit for purpose. So I've already outlined some common hazards for your workplaces. I can well imagine that that is going to be swimming pools, sports halls, gymnasiums. So again, we're thinking of the chemicals here. We're thinking of supervision. We're thinking of slips and trips. Outdoor pitches, you could almost cover lighting there, things like that, including icing conditions, how you're managing those things, how you're assessing the risk of weather. There's all sorts of different bits and pieces, and including changing rooms and the hygiene that's associated with all of those. So again, it's just making sure that all of those things are thought about and that they are risk assessed. There's another bit here as well. So I've mentioned inadequate supervision and training and planning. Transport is an interesting one. Making sure that you've got risk assessments for your management of road risk. That's particularly important if, for example, you have a minibus on the premises that you use, and making sure that your drivers are fit and competent to drive. So again, those sorts of things may not immediately fall into your field of vision, but they are things you need to consider. Fire and emergencies, it goes without saying, no one wants that reputational risk there. So again, getting your fire risk assessments completed by a competent person is an absolute must. And offsite activities are partially covered in relation to things like the transport. But again, it's working out how people are supervised when you're there, what they're doing, emergency procedures, and just planning for contingencies if the vehicle breaks down or if someone gets lost, things like that. So again, all of those things need to factor into your risk assessments and into your processes and procedures. So yeah, there's a number of different measures here. This is a good example for swimming pools. So I've mentioned in relation to the pool water quality chemicals and emergencies, there's a number of things for signage as well. But the other part of this is Legionella, obviously the water hygiene, making sure that you're keeping your records, you're keeping the water temperatures correct, and that you've got enough supervision and emergency processes in place. So all of these things really tie in, and I appreciate that it's quite complex for a number of businesses. So what I would implore you to do is find someone competent to do your water hygiene and your management, and then rely on that assessment and look through what are they recommending you do and how can they reduce your risk for you. I would go into a lot more detail, but I'm relatively limited on time today, and I've just got an eye on the timer down here. So one of the other elements here, which is really crucial, is your equipment safety. So yeah, a number of the things that come to mind are if you've got pitches, things like your lawnmowers, groundskeeping equipment. It can even be something as simple as your air conditioning systems, any play equipment, stuff like that. All of that needs to be maintained. And I would always recommend that you have a regular inspection and encourage your workers as well to do a pre-use check. If there's anything that's wrong with the equipment, tell them to isolate it, and you should have procedures in place as well so that it's clear what to do. So say, for example, I take the use of a ladder. If someone did a pre-use check, realized that the ladder wasn't fit for use, there should be a process in place to clearly mark that up and put it in somewhere that's quarantined so it can't be used until it's either repaired or replaced. So those sorts of things really, really crucial to making sure that you're doing a good proactive job at managing your equipment and making sure that it's fit for use. Scheduled maintenance is another one. So making sure that you know when your assets need to be maintained. So it's very unlikely that you'd have any sort of extraction as in a local exhaust ventilation or anything for a, let's say, sanders or a grinder or anything like that, but they need a thorough examination every 14 months. So it's, again, just making sure that those things are done and that your maintenance is scheduled in line with the service hours of the equipment and also any legislative or regulatory requirements. Record keeping, my motto basically is if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So again, having a really good, robust way of recording that can even be something as simple as a spreadsheet, as long as you're on top of it and you can demonstrate to someone, an inspector, that yes, you've done this, it's there on this date. Thinking about lifts on a premises, making sure that they are inspected and thoroughly examined every 6 months if they carry people. It's all of these things that you might not necessarily think are part of the day-to-day, but they actually do need to be thought about and they do need to be included. Safe storage as well. I've mentioned about segregation of equipment. That's basically storing it in the way that it's supposed to be stored. So if your manufacturer says, make sure that this is stored in a cool, dry place, that's what you do in effect. And also thinking about the security around it as well. Could it be dangerous for a student to get hold of? Is there, are there any hazards or risks associated with that? So again, making sure your security is there. So I've highlighted a bit about lighting and the and weather on pictures as well. We've got weather monitoring there, particularly important as we get down to these cooler months as well. But again, making sure your access routes are clear to there. So not just the pitch, but if they're having to walk along paths to get to it, that they're not slippery, that it's well lit, well maintained, particularly in the winter. And again, you've got those scheduled maintenance intervals. So someone going out when the temperature gets to below a certain point, and gritting, making sure that things are safe. And again, maybe sending out a member of staff just beforehand in some decent shoes to make sure that it is still safe for them to actually make their way to the pitch and the sports ground. So again, all of those sorts of things, as we get into winter, it sounds like common sense, and it is to a certain extent, but it's these little things that quite often get forgotten. And I can tell you now, working where I did before, we had a huge great estate of roads and also footpaths, and it was so difficult to get around all of them. So you may even have to close some of them off or just redirect people, communicate with parents if you've got a certain route that they need to come in, things like that. So I've mentioned about offsite activities. I didn't cover the parental consent item, but again, I won't go into too much detail about that because I'm sure that's an area that you're much more experienced with than me. The staff ratios is, again, a really crucial one. So what would you do if perhaps the people on the day phoned in sick? Do you have anyone else that you could use? Are you going to have bigger groups? How are you going to work that? But the one thing I think is really crucial here is that transport safety and those emergency plans. So those two, thinking about what do you do if the coach breaks down? What do you do if someone's taken ill and you need to get them to a hospital or the doctors, or even if you just need to arrange for a parent to collect them? So it's those things there. How do you work that process and how do you prime the parents so that they know who they need to pick up? Management of health and safety at work regs. Now, these are the ones that basically govern your risk assessment duty. They also govern the requirement to have a competent source of health and safety advice. So this is the founding sort of legislation that goes through and looks at your risk assessment, but there are also elements of this that translate over into the COSH risk assessment process and other areas. So what these do, in effect, is they set out risks and hazards. So what we're looking at here is a risk being something that has the potential to cause harm. So that's a hazard, and the risk is the likelihood of that harm occurring. So we tend to use a severity times consequence matrix. So you'll look at the severity and the likelihood of something to happen, and then you multiply that up in effect. So you'll quite often see these written there. So the higher severity you go, so the more highly likely it is. So 9 on there and a 9 for fatality. So what we're saying here is basically the further up the scale you are, the more likely you are to have a serious accident. The further down, the less likely you are, and the less severe the accident will be. But there are 5 steps to the risk assessment process, which the HC look at. So that is to identify the hazards, and then looking at what they are, assessing the risk. So how likely is it that that's going to occur? How likely is it that someone's going to be harmed by that? Implement controls. So having a look at what you can do to make sure that that harm doesn't occur, that it's less likely that that harm occurs. Record your findings, so write it down in effect, and then review your controls. Now, when we talk about a review, that can be something as simple as if the weather has changed on the day. So let's say you're going out, it's blazing sunshine, but actually you arrive and it's raining. What do you then do? So it's having those contingencies in place. You'd also need to review them if you've had an incident, because that shows that there was a control there that failed. So again, what do you do to learn, update that assessment and keep records so you can demonstrate that you've got things more under control as time goes on. But with all of these things, a risk assessment needs to be done by a competent person. And again, they can look like this. So you take the hazard and then who can be harmed and how, you document your controls, and then you have the overall risk rating at the end. So just making sure that they're documented. Also make sure that the people that need to read them have been involved. So this could be things like other members of staff, anyone that you're expecting to comply with a risk assessment in effect. I would encourage you to involve them early on. And the reason being, number one, if you do involve them earlier on, then you're going to comply with your consultation duties under the consultation with employees regs. But number two, if they don't follow it, you've got a signature and they've had input into it, you can hold them to account against it. So again, it puts you in a safer position as an employer or as someone responsible for doing this. You can actually say, look, you're aware of this. This is the process. Why was it not followed? So things like that can help if you have to do an investigation. So I've mentioned about your risk assessments. Other elements that you need to do, this is another one of those columns of the sort of health and safety pyramid, having the policy in place, having procedures in place. So again, I mentioned about emergency procedures, but training your staff in them and drilling them as well, so that they know what they need to do. They know, for instance, how to summon a first aider, something like that, where to go if the fire alarm goes off. And with all of these things, I'd start training people basically on day one. So it should be part of their induction, really. How do you get out of the building if the fire alarm goes off? Things like that. And again, if you've got visitors to the school, if you've got visitors to the premises in general, just making sure that people are aware of where to go if there is an emergency. So even things like that with people that may be transient on the premises, it's well worth doing that. And you can do that perhaps at the beginning, or if you are inviting people in, you can add that to the sort of invite if you liked. Workforce engagement, I've mentioned already. So that would be things like the consultation with them and actually just informing them when things are going wrong or when you need to tighten things up. So again, have you got any ideas on how we can prevent X, Y, and Z from happening? Quite often is a good one. Or another area I used to do is if I didn't fully understand how a bit of equipment worked or something like that, I would ask the question. I'd say, look, not familiar with that. You're the expert. Can you show me how this is safe or how this is done safely? And that would inform the risk assessment. So again, it's just getting all of the stakeholders that you need to involved. And also the continuous improvement side. So again, this is your internal checks. This is your pre-use checks. This is your proactive instant monitoring. This is all of these things factor into that continuous improvement cycle. So I've mentioned about the monitoring and measuring. I've done that to death near enough. And I've mentioned about continuous improvement. One thing I haven't mentioned is that external verification. So that's when a business like Citation comes in. So we can actually go in do an inspection on the premises and actually give you a bit of a stopgap as to where you're doing well, where you need to improve, and we can help you by putting it in a priority order. There's no reason why you can't do this yourself, but it does help to get that external check done because it's someone that should be relatively impartial to your premises. So they always say in this business, we're in the business of telling someone their baby is ugly. In effect, we're in the business of saying, look, this might be your pride and joy, but these are areas that we need you to improve on for your own compliance benefit, but also for the welfare of your workers. So you'll end up with a report, and then it's a good idea to go through and actually prioritize those actions. So yeah, this is just an overall dashboard as to how it can look. But again, you can have all sorts of different ways of managing this. I've seen people manage their equipment registers with a dedicated calendar, which tells them when they need to do maintenance on things. They've got all sorts of different ways of doing it. I'm going to recommend our platform because I think it's brilliant. But again, as long as you're managing over all that risk, you know what your indicators are, you know when your equipment maintenance is due, you know when your training's due to expire, you know that your risk assessments are all in date. Those are all good things that basically will help you improve and will help demonstrate to an inspector that you have a grip. So yeah, let's have a quick look. I've already spoken about instant reporting, but one of the things that I will cover just quickly is you have a duty, obviously, to report accidents and incidents, and your staff members should be doing that. You also have a duty to report certain ones to the health and safety executive, to the government, in effect. Now, there's also elements of this where you could have something that's gone wrong but didn't result in an accident. So let's say someone noticed a damaged ladder but didn't use it, reported it. That is proactive, and it's useful to record those things as well and show what you did to prevent that happening again. So you're talking then about a much more proactive system. That's a really good standard to get to. And that, as someone that used to inspect, if I saw that people had their staff members proactively noticing faults and hazards and that the management were putting them right, I was in a really happy place with that, because it said that you had eyes and ears on the ground looking for things and looking to make things better. So again, all of these proactive things really, really help. And hopefully it will help remove the requirement to report things to the government. So there's a summary on the screen here. I won't go through all of them, but in effect, if you're a Citation member, please contact us before you contact the government, because we will literally delve into the depths of the legislation to work out whether you need to report anything or not. But the one thing that you will definitely need to report is all deaths. So any deaths. And the other one that you might not be aware of, dangerous occurrences. So some of these include things like scaffold collapse and the like. So again, it's things that aren't necessarily, even if it doesn't kill anyone or hurt anyone, that may well be reportable. And the other one is gas incidences. So that can be things like an explosion. So again, making sure that you're getting your boilers and things serviced by competent people who are on the gas safe register, absolutely crucial. So again, all of these things all factor in, and it's just worthwhile bearing these things in mind when you're looking at contractors, making sure you get someone that's competent, reputable, insured, and they can demonstrate that to you as well. So I'll spend the last portion of this talking about where the HSE is currently going, and therefore, in effect, the rest of the government, because they are the lead on all things health and safety. So this is their strategy, which they published about 2 years ago now, and it was quite quiet. But the main thing that they are now focusing on is the work-related ill health, and they are definitely focusing on mental health and stress. And as part of that, actually, they require employers to do things like stress risk assessments. But their business plan this year, and it will change in the coming months, I think it's going to update again in April, they're looking at health-related issues. So that's why I've mentioned things about the paints, the chemicals in the pools, even things like if you are sanding down floors, management of wood dust is a big area that they're looking at. Hazardous substances, all of those things that may require health surveillance. So even if you've got an in-house maintenance team, if they're dealing with lead work a lot of the time, things like that, then you need to do health surveillance. So there's a number of different strands here that they're looking at, and they're basically going in and focusing on. So with all of these things, it does mean that you need to make sure that you're still managing your physical hazards, because those musculoskeletal things haven't gone away. So that's looking at reducing your manual handling, and also looking at your workplace ergonomics. So making sure that people aren't bending and stretching unnecessarily, things like that. Make sure the training's in place as well. But the other ones here, which are really quite important, are things like the stress and the mental health. So I'm going to have a quick look here, because I've mentioned about this, but does anyone want to just pop in the chat how many people they think this year or each year suffer from work-related stress, mental health, and anxiety? I think I mentioned the figure earlier on. I don't know if anyone's got access to the chat or not, because I can't see it. I think some of you may be on your phones. Has anyone said anything in the chat, or is it it's minimized for me so I can't see?
Nothing in the chat so far, Michael.
Nothing in the chat.
Everyone's too
That's fine.
shy.
No, it's all good. Well, look, the reason the HSE and the government are looking at this so much is because last year the figure was 776,000. So that's the equivalent of the population of Leeds, which is a big old city. But in effect, this year we've added another 188,000 to that number, which is basically the equivalent of adding Swansea to Leeds, the population of both of those places together. So 964,000 workers, which is absolutely enormous. So 222.1 million working days are estimated to be lost due to stress, depression, and anxiety. And it probably won't surprise you on this call to learn that the third most affected sector is education. So, massive, massive thing that the government are looking at here. So what you need to do is look at proactive measures to manage that. The first thing you need to do, though, is make sure that you have a stress risk assessment in place, and that is governed by the HSE's stress management standards. So that's your job demands. So that can include things like workload, work patterns, control. So how much control do your workers have over the way that they do their job? The role, is it clear what they're supposed to be doing? Are the roles clearly defined contractually in their minds? Have people's roles drifted over time? Support as well. So, excuse me. So how much resource is given to make sure that they can do their job effectively? How supportive are the management positions, or the other higher tiers of education leader in your premises? How does that work? Relationships, again, so managing conflict, making sure that people aren't seen to just sort of get away with things. And the final one, which I think is probably the most important, is managing change. Now, I'm very aware that a lot of schools, and education in particular, does seem to be a bit of a political football. The best thing you can do as employers and people responsible for that is just to communicate very clearly with your workers about change, and just make sure that they're actually on board and they understand what's happening, why, and when. But with all of these management standards, put them on a risk assessment and work out what you do as your controls to manage that risk. I then want you to think about what you do proactively. So that can be things like introducing questionnaires which cover things like these questions. How much control do you think you have over your working day? Do you feel supported in your role? And those things, then you can actually work your way back from. So you've got that data and you can go, right, how do we improve this? So again, it's that continuous improvement. I think there's an issue, there's a case at the moment with a University of Birmingham where they, in effect, have been shopped in to the HSE, and they said, well, we've got a stress risk assessment, there you go. And the HSE went, okay, but what are you doing proactively to monitor this? So again, they would expect to see things like those questionnaires, employee assistance programs, things like that. But if things have gone wrong, or if you do think that one of your workers may be suffering from stress, there's also individual stress assessments that you can do, wellness recovery action plans, and there's also things like mental health first aiders, which are great. So really useful resource for any workplace. However, one thing you should just need to bear in mind is that the HSE updated L74, which is their first aid at work guidance, about last year, probably this time last year. And that now means that when you come to review it, you'll need to look at signposting for mental health and for stress as well. So that's actually in the HSE's approved code of practice for first aid. Again, if you're a Citation customer, we've got a template for that that you can download and use. But have a look. If you haven't already, do a bit of a review and just work out what it is you need to do for that. But again, hopefully that's been helpful for everyone. I'm very conscious of time. I think I've just about clinched it. Chris, I guess I'm going to hand back to yourself now. Hopefully that's not caused more questions than it's answered. But if anyone does want to raise anything, obviously get in touch with us. But with all of these things, as I said before, the main focus for the HC at the moment and for any government inspectorate really is going to be that reduction of risk management and also looking at the stress, mental health, and illness side. So thank you very much.
That was brilliant, Michael. Thanks so much for sharing. Lots of great information there, very professional as well. So um, I've obviously videoed this. I'll put it on the PADSIS website. And Ian has very kindly put his email address in the chat. Obviously, if anybody has any questions, that they want to forward to me or to Ian, I'm chris@padsis.com. Michael's very kindly put up the email and a QR code there. So if anyone's got any questions, please come on now or put them in the chat. If not, we'll call it a night there. And so Michael and I will stay on. As I say, if you want to stay and ask a question, that'd be great. Otherwise, it's great to see you all and thanks for giving me your time up on a Monday evening. It just shows what great commitment the Director of Sport World has. So thanks for that.